I'm holding in my hands right here the title deed to my first ever apartment here in Dubai. I have just closed on it last week, and in this video I will walk you through literally step by step, every single step of the process of what it actually took me to buy this property. Starting all the way from how I was able to get a mortgage here as a self-employed entrepreneur, to when we were doing viewings, to closing on the property, as well as the entire process from actually locking in that I wanted to buy this specific property, to actually being able to finally move in here, because the process was actually a bit longer and slightly more complicated than I perhaps anticipated. And to be fair, in most cases, it would actually be a bit easier than what it was for me. I'll go through that later on in this video. But essentially, if you are someone who's looking to buy property in Dubai, after watching this video, you're gonna have an exact timeline for how long you can expect it to take. So there will be no surprises in the process. You will know exactly what is going to happen step by step, because this is the kind of video that I really wish I had when I was going through this process, because there's so many steps there that I just didn't know about. And I was always asking, like, okay, so what happens next? When can I expect to move in and things like that? So first of all, before we get into the actual process, what did I buy? I bought a 1-bedroom apartment in Dubai Creek Harbor. And in a separate video, I'll go over all the finances of the costs and all the fees, because there's a lot of them, by the way, and everything like that. But in this video, we'll just go through the process. But just briefly, the total price of the property was 2.3 million dirhams. I have a 40% mortgage on it, meaning I put a 40% down payment. And this is a ready property. It was an unfurnished property as well. So if you're hearing some echo in this video, it's because we still haven't fully furnished it. It's pretty finished right now. And to note as well, this is the process when buying through a mortgage, and also when the seller has a mortgage, because what I learned is that the process, and especially the length of the process, highly depends on whether you have a mortgage or if you're a cash buyer. Being a cash buyer means it's going to be quicker, and also if the seller has a mortgage. So this is kind of the most complicated case possible, because I was buying with a mortgage and the seller also had a mortgage. But first, let's just go back to the beginning. First of all, how was I able to get a mortgage in the first place? Because in Dubai, it's actually not super easy to get a mortgage if you don't work like a salaried job. If you're a self-employed, you're a business owner, banks here are more conservative. They have higher requirements. So TLDR, I used a mortgage advisor who was able to find me a bank who was willing to lend me money. Going through him, it's all extremely smooth. But I know that if I hadn't used him, because my friend actually tried to do this on his own just by talking to banks directly, so you can do this on your own, but I would actually highly recommend, especially if you're self-employed, to use a mortgage advisor. Now, if you're interested to use the same mortgage advisor who I used, was absolutely excellent, super professional, cannot speak more highly of him. You can actually book a free consultation down below to also use the same real estate agent that I use. So if you use the same people that I used, who I had an absolutely amazing experience with, they will give you all the contacts that you need. Now, if you don't do that, obviously you can try to do this on your own, but you're gonna need to find an agent anyway. And let's just say a lot of the agents in Dubai aren't that good. And if you use the mortgage advisor, they essentially get a commission from the bank, so it's not even extra cost to you. So that is how I was able to get a mortgage. I was able to get it for 40%. You can even try to get it for 20%, but that is going to be much more difficult unless, again, you work for a big company or something like that. So the first step of the process is that you get a pre-approval from the bank for your mortgage. Essentially, they will give you a statement saying that we are willing to lend you money up to this amount. So I got the pre-approval up to 2.3 million dirhams. So that's the maximum property value, although I'm pretty sure I would have been able to get more, but this was like the maximum that I thought I was going to spend. So I just didn't even try to get it for higher than that. I started talking to the mortgage advisor and getting the pre-approval somewhere around late July. I believe it was like 20th of July. And in early August, it might have been like the first week of August, I received the pre-approval from the bank. So now I was ready to start doing some viewings. And whenever you get the pre-approval, it is going to be valid for 30 days. If it takes you longer than that to find the property, then essentially you just have to extend it. So around mid-August, I started to do viewings. I reached out to my agent, who is again the same agent you can work with if you want to. I told him my requirements. Okay, I want to buy a place to live in. I'm looking at these areas, which were Dubai Creek Harbor, so Heartland, as well as downtown. And essentially he started arranging me a bunch of viewings. We did a couple of rounds of viewings, and then TLDR, I ended up deciding on this specific property, which is actually the most expensive one that we viewed here in the building called The Grand in Dubai Creek Harbor. I just really liked the feeling of this building. The amenities were great. It's also the biggest one. So then on the 16th of August, I told him, this is the one I want, let's make an offer. And then the next day, on the 17th of August, the offer was accepted. We were able to get a slight discount on it through my agent negotiating, and that is when the closing process started. Now, the length of this closing process really again depends on whether you have a mortgage, whether the seller has a mortgage, like how motivated each of you are to get this done quickly, and if you have mortgages, essentially how long it takes the banks to do all the different processes and things like that. But the next step on the same day, 17th of August, was to sign what is called the Form F, which is like an agreement where you and the seller are committing to make this transaction. If either of the parties back out of this agreement after signing this Form F, there is a 10% penalty, meaning that because the property value was 2.3 million dirhams, if I backed out and I said, actually, no, I don't want to buy it, I would have to pay a penalty of 10% of the property value, meaning 230,000 dirhams. And of course, neither of us wants to do that. So that basically means that the deal is closed. The next step is for the buyer's bank to do a valuation. So essentially, the bank will independently value the property to make sure that it is worth what you are paying for it. And the next day after that, I went to the bank physically to open an account with this particular bank. And then the next day after that, on the 21st of August, the valuation came back already from the bank at the exact price that I had agreed to pay for it. Now, normally this would take 5 working days, but I guess because my mortgage advisor has a good relationship with the bank and things like that, we were able to expedite this. So this was completed extremely quickly. And then already the next day after that, I had to go to the bank again to sign the final offer letter, which is essentially confirming that yes, you are now getting the mortgage from this bank at these terms and things like that. Now at this point, everything was going extremely smoothly. It looks like we could even fully close on this property by the end of August, or at the latest like mid-September. However, this is where the delay started to come in, because as I told you before, the process is a bit more complicated if you have a mortgage and the seller has a mortgage, because what has to happen is that the banks like talk to each other. And by talking to each other, I don't mean like talking on the phone. It literally means that they are like sending letters back and forth to each other, because what has to happen now that I've agreed to buy it, I've got the mortgage from the bank will actually close the remaining mortgage from the seller. And in order to do that, the seller has to request what is called a liability letter from their bank, essentially telling the other bank that this is the exact amount that is still owed, so that the buyer's bank, so my bank, can write a manager's check to the seller's bank to clear this remaining mortgage balance. And unfortunately, the seller's bank was one of the worst banks in Dubai that happens to be extremely slow with these kind of processes. And also in these kind of cases, the seller's bank actually has an incentive to be kind of slow with providing this liability letter, because it means that the more they delay this, the more interest they can collect. So this essentially happened. So it took a long time for them to get the liability letter. And then through some series of circumstances, which I'm still not quite sure like how this happened, the liability letter actually expired, because what has to happen is that it has to be collected physically from the seller's bank and then delivered physically to the buyer's bank. And because it, for some reason, took so long to do this, this liability letter actually expired. So they had to issue another liability letter, which again took a long time. And then somehow again, this liability letter expired a second time. So at this whole time, like I was expecting that this was going to be completed by like late August, mid-September or something like that. So I was always booking accommodation for like 2 weeks or a week or something like that, because I was like, okay, it's going to be closed. I don't want to pay for an expensive Airbnb if I don't have to. And there was delay after delay after delay. So I had to like keep booking new Airbnbs, new hotels. I had to keep moving until finally in early October, so more than a month after this previous step, they were finally able to deliver this liability letter to my bank, and then the bank essentially issued a manager's check in favor of the seller's bank to clear their mortgage, and also another manager's check which would then be given to the seller on the transfer date for the remaining sales value. So the next step was for my bank to issue these checks, and for these checks to be again physically delivered to the seller's bank. So this is where like the UAE banking processes can be still slightly outdated, like you have checks that are being physically delivered from place to place and things like that. And again, because we're talking about the bank, it takes them a while to do this. They issue the check and then it takes a while for this check to be delivered to the seller's bank and then cashed in at the seller's bank, clearing that mortgage. And then after that, the next step is for the seller's bank to issue what is called a clearance letter, essentially confirming that the mortgage has been cleared. We are good to go for the transfer. And this is supposed to take a maximum of 7 working days, but it took them longer than that, of course. So this was now in mid-October, so more than 2 months after it was initially essentially supposed to be completed. We finally got the confirmation from the seller's bank that we are good to go for the mortgage is cleared, we're good to go for the transfer. And the final step after all of this is done is to book a transfer in a trustee office in Dubai. It is now the 27th of October and it is finally time to head to the transfer. So what happens now is that we go to a DLD trustee office where I'm gonna be and the seller is gonna be and my agent is gonna be and a bunch of other people, and we're going to officially complete the transfer. So if everything goes to plan, as of an hour from now or something like that, I'm going to be finally the official owner of this property. And I have some manager's checks over here, which I'm going to use to pay the DLD fees, the agency fees, and a bunch of other fees, which I'm going to have to pay by card. So wish me luck. Something to know about this is that for this transfer date, both the buyer and the seller, or a power of attorney from either side, if they want to, has to be physically present in Dubai at the same time. So this has to be arranged. So it actually took another week or 2 for both of us to be available. Well, I was always available, but for him to be available as well. So we booked this transfer date on the 27th of October in a trustee office in Dubai, and the transfer was finally completed. So in total, it took more than 2 months to go through this entire process. If I didn't have a mortgage, if they didn't have a mortgage, it could have been much quicker. And even with the mortgage, to be fair, it is usually much quicker than this. But this is something to expect, that there might be delays because some party might be delaying some part of the process. Something might not be organized. You might be working with banks and banks are always slow. So if I was doing this again, I would have a much lower expectations on when this is actually going to be completed. But essentially, eventually it was completed. I have now been able to move in. And once you move in, there are a couple of practical steps that you have to do. You have to activate the DIWA, which is the water and electricity. And in case you're in an apartment that doesn't have air conditioning included, you're gonna have to activate that. Luckily, in all MR buildings, air conditioning is actually included in your service charges, so I didn't have to do anything specific for that. If you're in a building that uses gas for cooking, like my building, you have to activate gas. So you have to find the gas provider and then essentially arrange with them to activate the gas in your building. And obviously you have to furnish it. So we've spent the past couple of days essentially hunting furniture in a couple of different stores. Again, I'm gonna make more content on that in the future. And with that, that is essentially the full process from start to finish to buy a ready property in Dubai with a mortgage. And because this video is already quite long, I'm gonna actually make a part 2 to this video where I discuss all the costs and the fees that went into actually closing and moving into this property. We'll talk about all the government fees, the mortgage fees, agent fees, which is so many of those, as well as how much it cost me to furnish the space because this was totally unfurnished, didn't even have appliances. So you can also have a good idea of that. But I hope that this video gave you value. If it did, you can watch another video right here. And with that, I will see you in the next video.